My CEO husband hid me for 10 years. Nobody expected me to speak 10 languages at the gala. The invitation was sitting on the kitchen counter when Mei Lin came downstairs that morning. One crisp white envelope, the Zhao Group crest embossed in gold on the flap, and on the front, in the neat print of Elliot's assistant, a single name. His. Just his. Not hers. Not even a second line left blank. Just his name, as if she did not live in the same house, sleep in the same bed, breathe the same air for the past 10 years. She stood in the kitchen in her robe and looked at it for a long time. The coffee machine beeped behind her. She did not move. She had known, of course. She had always known. But knowing a thing and seeing it printed on a white envelope in gold ink were two very different experiences, and her chest understood the difference, even when her face did not show it. She poured her coffee. She sat down at the long dining table that could seat 12, and had never seated more than 2. She opened her Portuguese novel to the page she had marked the night before and began to read. That was how Mei Lin had lived for the better part of a decade. Quietly, carefully, in rooms that were large and well-furnished and completely without witnesses. She had married Elliot Zhao at 26. He was 31 then, already climbing. Already the kind of man who entered rooms and changed the temperature of them without trying. She had been finishing her linguistics degree, fluent in 4 languages, working on a 5th, full of a particular kind of quiet ambition that people who do not know what to do with quiet ambition tend to overlook entirely. Elliot had not overlooked it, not at first. He had found it interesting. He had told her so more than once, in the early months. He had sat across from her at dinner tables and listened to her talk about the structure of Japanese honorifics and the way Swahili absorbed loanwords, and he had looked at her like she was something he wanted to keep. She had believed that look. She had built her next 10 years on it. The house they lived in now was in one of the newer gated neighborhoods in the city, the kind of neighborhood where the hedges were always trimmed and the cars in the driveways were always clean, and no one ever raised their voice, because no one ever had to. The house itself was large enough that 2 people could go an entire day without crossing paths if they were careful about it. Elliot was careful about it. She was not bitter about this. She had moved past bitter somewhere around year 4, and landed somewhere harder and quieter and more useful. What she felt now, on most days, was something closer to a decision that had not yet been made in words. The staff came at 9. There was a housekeeper, a gardener, and a driver. They were all polite to her, in the careful way that people are polite to someone they are not sure has any actual authority. She was kind to them in return. She learned their names, their actual names, not the shortened ones Elliot used. She asked about their families. She remembered. The gardener, Owen, was originally from a small town in Wales. She had started practicing her Welsh on him in year 6, haltingly at first, pulling words out of a grammar book she had ordered online. The look on his face the first time she greeted him in his own language was something she had held on to on difficult days. He had gone still, in the way that people go still, when something unexpected touches them directly in the chest. Then he had laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine, and they had talked for 40 minutes about the rain back home. That had been her life. Stolen conversations in languages that were hers. Books, grammar exercises at the kitchen table after Elliot left for the office. Online seminars from universities in cities she had never visited. A notebook, then 2, then a shelf of them, filled with vocabulary lists and verb conjugations, and small handwritten notes to herself in Arabic, in Russian, in Korean, languages that no one in this house had ever asked her to speak. She was not trying to prove anything. That was important. She had not been driven by spite or strategy, not in those early years. She had simply needed somewhere to put herself. The languages were a place she could be completely present, completely capable, completely real, when the rest of her life had been reduced to a series of rooms she moved through without leaving a mark. By the time the invitation arrived on the counter that morning, she could hold a proper conversation in 10 languages, not tourist level, not phrasebook level. She meant the kind of fluency that lives in the body, the kind where you dream in the language, where you catch a joke before the punchline, where a stranger on the street hears you and feels, genuinely and without qualification, heard. Nobody knew this. That was the strangest part, and also, If she was honest, the part she had thought about most. Elliot did not know. His colleagues did not know. The housekeeper had told Owen about the Welsh. But beyond that small circle, she was simply Elliot Zhou's wife. A woman of no particular professional distinction, present at no public events, unnamed in every article, untagged in every photograph. A household fixture, a kept thing. She turned a page of her novel. The coffee was good. She had ground the beans herself, a habit from year 3 that she had never dropped. Small pleasures. She had become very good at small pleasures. Around 10 o'clock, she went upstairs to the study, the small one at the end of the hall, the one Elliot never used because it faced the garden rather than the street, and he preferred to see what was coming. She sat at the desk there, opened her Japanese workbook, and spent 2 hours reviewing the specific register of speech used in formal business negotiations. She had been working on this particular register for 3 months. It was precise, layered, deeply sensitive to context. Getting it wrong was not merely embarrassing. In the right setting, getting it wrong could quietly end a professional relationship before it began. She was not practicing for any professional relationship of her own. She had no professional relationships. She was practicing because the workbook was there, and the morning was long, and she had been doing this long enough that stopping felt stranger than continuing. At noon, she ate lunch alone at the kitchen table. At 2, she walked in the garden, slowly, while Owen pruned the rose beds and they exchanged a few sentences in Welsh. At 4, she began preparing dinner, though Elliot had sent a message at 3 saying he would be home late and not to wait. She cooked anyway. She ate. She left the rest covered on the stove. By 8 o'clock, she was back at the dining table with the Portuguese novel and a glass of water, and the white envelope still sitting where it had been since morning. She had not touched it all day. She had moved around it like it was a piece of furniture she was accustomed to. At 8:15, Elliot came home. She heard the front door, the specific sound of his footsteps in the entrance hall, the way he dropped his keys on the side table without looking. She did not look up from her book. He came into the dining room. He saw her. He saw the envelope. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not exactly. Something more like a man who has been caught in a situation he had already prepared an explanation for. "Long day," he said. "I imagine," she said. He picked up the envelope. "The gala is next Friday." "I know. I have to go early. There will be a lot of people to manage." She looked up at him then. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that he shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other. She had known this man for 12 years. She knew every small physical signal he used when he was managing a conversation rather than having one. "I know," she said again. He nodded. He said goodnight. He went upstairs. She sat at the table for another hour after she heard the bedroom door close. The house was completely quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but that is simply the absence of anyone willing to speak. She closed her novel. She looked at the envelope. Then she did something she had never done before. In 10 years of quietly acceptable behavior, she went to the study, opened her laptop, and booked a ticket. Not to anywhere far, just a single entry ticket to the Zhao Group annual gala, via the public registration portal that had been listed, somewhat carelessly, on the company's press page. She completed the form. First name, May. Last name, Lin. Affiliation, independent guest. She submitted it. Then she went back downstairs, rinsed her coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel afraid. What she felt, lying in the dark on her side of the bed while Elliot's breathing leveled into sleep beside her, was the particular and very specific feeling of a door that has been opened after standing shut for a very long time. Cool air. The faint scent of somewhere else. The solid, factual knowledge that whatever came next, she had decided it herself. She closed her eyes. She slept better than she had in years. The morning after she registered for the gala, Maylin found herself standing in front of the wardrobe in the spare bedroom, the one that held her older things, the things she had brought into this house before she understood what kind of house it was going to become, and she was not looking for anything in particular. She ran her hand along the hangers. a charcoal blazer she had bought during her last year of university, a dark blue dress she had worn to a wedding in year one of the marriage, before the invitations to weddings stopped coming, because she was never available to attend and eventually people stopped checking. A pair of shoes, flat and practical, that she had worn to a lecture she had snuck into at the City University 3 winters ago, a lecture on computational linguistics, which she had found so fascinating she had stood in the doorway for the last 40 minutes rather than disturb the room. She pulled out the dark blue dress. She held it against herself in the old mirror propped against the wall. It still fit. Of course it did. She had not changed very much. Physically, she ate well, she walked every day, she slept, or she was sleeping better now, since the night she registered. She looked at the woman in the mirror for a longer moment than she usually allowed herself. She put the dress back. She was not ready to think about the dress yet. There were other things to attend to first. That week was ordinary on its surface. Elliot left every morning at 7:15. He came home between 7 and 9 in the evening. They exchanged the necessary words. He did not mention the gala again. She did not ask. But underneath the ordinary week, something was running. A current, quiet and continuous, like a river beneath ice. She felt it when she sat down at her study desk. She felt it when she pulled out the Japanese workbook and flipped past the formal negotiation register to a section she had not touched in months, the particular emotional registers of formal Japanese speech. The way language could convey respect and distance and, occasionally, warm humanity, all within the same sentence. She had always found this beautiful, that a language could hold so many things at once, without dropping any of them. She thought about Elliot's business partner, a man named Clive Burton, who had called the house only once, early in the marriage, and asked to speak to Elliot. And when she had said Elliot was unavailable, and offered to take a message, there had been a pause on the line before Clive said, pleasantly but distinctly, "That's all right. I'll reach him through the office," as if she were a service rather than a person, as if the message might not get through if it passed through her hands. She had thought about that pause, on and off, for 10 years. She had met Clive twice in person, at events she had attended early in the marriage, before Elliot began to disinvite her. Not openly, never a direct conversation, just a gradual withdrawal of information, a forgetting to mention things until it was too late to arrange a sitter or a car. Clive was the kind of man who looked past women who were not immediately useful to him. She had been invisible to him before she had even had the chance to become visible. She thought about the gala. She thought about the guest list, which she had found online with approximately 4 minutes of searching, because Elliot's assistant had pasted it into an industry networking forum as a way to generate excitement for the event. She read through the names carefully. 14 countries represented, at least 3 guests whose primary language was not English, whose presence at an English-language event would almost certainly result in at least one moment of confusion or missed connection. One name stood out: Hiroshi Tanaka, a name she recognized, not personally, but professionally, in the way she tracked things, through the business journals she read to keep her mind occupied in the long afternoons. Hiroshi Tanaka was the head of a Japanese infrastructure investment group. He was famously particular about respect. He had walked out of a meeting in Singapore 2 years ago, according to the report she had read, because an interpreter had used the wrong honorific, not the wrong meaning, the wrong honorific. The meeting had collapsed. 2 years of negotiations had dissolved in one misread social signal. He was going to be at the gala. There would be an interpreter provided, presumably. There was always an interpreter provided, but interpreters were not always adequate, and adequate was not always enough, and some situations required not just the correct words but the correct weight behind them, the warmth, the genuine familiarity, the small cultural instincts that a person developed not from a course, but from years of loving a language until it loved them back. Mei Lin sat with this thought for a while. She did not make any plans. She was simply aware. That Thursday, 4 days before the gala, she was in the kitchen when she heard Elliot on the phone, in the study down the hall. The door was not fully closed. She was not trying to listen. She was filling the kettle at the sink and the water was running, and even so she caught it clearly, the way you catch a sound that is meant for someone else when your own name appears in it. "She's not relevant to any of this, Clive," Elliot was saying. His voice was low, but it was the studied low of a man speaking quietly on purpose, not because he was afraid of being heard. I keep things separated. She has nothing to do with the professional side. She never has. She turned off the tap. The silence in the kitchen was very complete. After the merger, I'll handle it, Elliot said. It's not a concern right now. She stood at the sink with the full kettle in her hand. The kettle was heavier than she expected. She set it down gently on the counter. Handle it. The phrase sat in the middle of her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not because it was surprising. She had understood for some time that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. But because hearing it said out loud, casually, in that voice he used when he was at his most professionally assured, was different from knowing it. It was the envelope again, but louder. It was the invitation with one name on it, but spoken. She put the kettle on the heat. She waited for it to boil. She made her tea. She carried it to the study, her study, the small one at the end of the hall, and she sat down and she opened her Arabic workbook, not because she had planned to work on Arabic that afternoon, but because her hands needed something to do, and her mind needed somewhere to go, that was entirely her own territory. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. She did not go back into the hall. She did not walk past the study door where Elliot's call had ended, and where he was now, presumably, doing whatever men do after they have decided how to handle things. She stayed in her room with her books and her notebooks and her quiet, patient, accumulated knowledge, and by the time the evening came she had written 4 pages of notes in Arabic that were as clean and as precise as anything she had ever written. She did not feel angry. She had felt angry before, in earlier years, and had learned that anger in this house moved only inward, because there was no one to receive it, no argument it could enter. She had learned to put the energy of it into other things, smaller things, sharper things. She felt, instead, the solidifying of something, the way cement goes from liquid to solid, not in a moment you can see, but in a moment that has already happened by the time you press your hand to it and find it unmovable. On Friday evening, the gala was the following Friday, she went to the spare bedroom and took out the dark blue dress again. She looked at it properly this time. She thought about it. Then she put it back, went online, and ordered a different one. Not expensive, not designed to make a statement, just clean, well-fitted, the kind of thing a person wore when they were completely comfortable with where they were going. She used her own account to pay for it. She had her own account. She always had. It was a small thing, maintaining it. One of the first small things she had done in year 2 when she first began to understand the shape of the life she was inside. It had 2 years of quiet, careful savings in it. Money from the household management budget that Elliot transferred monthly without reading the statements. Saved in small increments. Not because she had been planning anything specific, but because having it felt like being able to breathe through both lungs instead of one. The dress arrived on Tuesday. She tried it on in the spare bedroom and looked in the old mirror and thought, yes, that is exactly right. She did not show anyone. There was no one to show. On Wednesday, she confirmed her registration for the gala had been approved. The email addressed her by her first name. It said she was welcome to attend. She was welcome to attend. She read the email twice. Then she made dinner and set one place at the table and sat down and ate. And outside the window the garden was going dark and the roses Owen had pruned were closed against the evening. And she thought about all the rooms she had sat in and all the languages she had learned inside them. And she thought about the morning coming, and the one after that, and the Friday at the end of the week that was going to be unlike any Friday she had spent in this house. She finished her dinner. She washed her plate. She turned out the kitchen light. She went upstairs, and in the small study at the end of the hall she opened her Japanese workbook to the business negotiation register, and she read until midnight, and every word sat in her mind as solidly and as naturally as her own name. The ballroom of the Ashford Grand was not built to make people feel comfortable. It was built to make people feel the weight of being in the right room. The high vaulted ceiling, the chandeliers dripping crystal, the polished floor that threw your own reflection back at you slightly too clean, slightly too bright. The kind of room where you understood immediately that everyone present was being evaluated, and that the evaluation had begun before anyone opened their mouth. Mei Lin arrived at 7:45. The gala was scheduled to begin at 8. She had timed it deliberately. Not so early that she was standing alone in an empty room. Not so late that she had to push through a crowd to find her footing. She handed her registration to the young woman at the desk, who checked her name on the list, looked up at her with a perfectly professional smile, and said, "Welcome, Ms. Lin. Please enjoy the evening." Miss Lin, not Mrs. Zhao. She had registered under Lin, which was the name on her own account, the name on her own passport, the name she had been born with, and had never, she now realized, been in any hurry to give away. The ballroom was already filling. Men in dark suits, women in dresses that had clearly been chosen with the chandeliers in mind, waitstaff moving through the room in smooth, rehearsed arcs, carrying trays of things that sparkled. She took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood at the edge of the room for exactly 3 minutes, long enough to map it. She had always done this, entered a space and spent a few quiet moments understanding the shape of it before she committed to moving through it. It was a habit that had started as social caution and had somewhere along the way become something more like a skill. She could read a room. She knew where the power was sitting and where the anxiety was hiding, and which conversations were going well, and which ones had hit a wall. The wall she spotted first was in the far left corner. A man in a gray suit, European, mid-50s, was speaking with some effort to a woman from the Zhao Group's events team, and the effort was visible from across the room. His English was formal but stiff, the English of someone who had learned it from textbooks rather than from life, and the events woman was smiling very hard in the way that people smile when they are following approximately 60% of what they are hearing and hoping the percentage holds. Mei Lin moved toward them unhurriedly. "Bonsoir," she said, arriving at the man's shoulder. He turned. His entire face changed. "Bonsoir," he said, with a relief so immediate it was almost funny. "Vous parlez français?" "Oui, bien sûr," she said. "Permettez-moi." She turned to the events woman and said quietly in English, "I'll take it from here if you like. I'll bring him to the seating coordinator when we're done." The events woman's relief matched the man's. She excused herself with a grateful nod. Mei Lin spent 8 minutes with the French delegate. His name was Arnaud. He was representing a European infrastructure fund that was in early discussions with the Zhao Group, and his primary concern that evening was understanding the dinner seating arrangement, because he had been placed, according to the draft plan he had seen, next to a man he had an unresolved professional disagreement with, and he was hoping to address this quietly before the evening began. She listened. She understood, not just the words, but the particular French concern with maintaining dignity and the management of social friction. She walked him to the seating coordinator herself and explained the situation in simple, clear English. The coordinator adjusted the arrangement in 4 minutes. Arnaud thanked her with a warmth that came from somewhere real. She smiled and moved on. She had been in the room for 22 minutes when she saw Elliot. He was standing near the center of the room with Clive Burton and 2 other men she recognized from the company's press photographs. He was laughing at something. He was completely at ease in the way that men who have designed their environments are at ease. The ease of a man who knows every exit, every seat, every arrangement, because he arranged it. He had not seen her yet. She did not move toward him. She was not there for him. She was there because a Brazilian delegate named Gustavo was standing alone near the east wall with his phone out, clearly translating something on a screen with an expression of concentrated frustration. And she crossed the room and said, in Portuguese, "Can I help?" He stared at her. "You speak Portuguese?" "Yes," she said. "What do you need?" What he needed was help understanding a clause in a preliminary document that had been circulated before the dinner, a document that had been written in English and translated by someone who knew the words but not the legal context, so that a phrase that should have read as a standard liability disclaimer had come out reading, in Portuguese, as something close to an admission of fault. He had been trying to determine whether this was intentional. It was not intentional. It was a translation error. She explained this to him clearly, explained what the original English likely intended, and suggested he request a revised copy before signing anything. He listened. He nodded. He put the phone away. "Who are you?" he asked. "Mei Lin," she said. "Do you work for the Zhao Group?" She looked at him for a moment. "I'm an independent guest," she said. He nodded as if this made complete sense. and she excused herself and moved on, and she did not look back at the center of the room where she knew, without checking, that Elliot had seen her by now because she could feel the particular quality of attention that comes from someone who is watching you and trying to work out what is happening. She let him watch. The Korean delegate found her next, or she found him. It was difficult to say. His name was Sung Jin Park, and he was caught in a conversation with one of the Zhao Group's senior managers that had become uncomfortable because a cultural misunderstanding about hierarchy had introduced a tension that neither party knew how to navigate. Sung Jin was a quiet man, precise, the kind of man who noticed everything and reacted to nothing on his face. But she caught the small signal, the slight stiffening around his eyes, the way his responses had become shorter and more formal, and she stepped in smoothly, addressed him in Korean with the correct level of deference, redirected the conversation to neutral professional ground, and left both men feeling, she hoped, that the evening had recovered itself. This was what 10 languages actually felt like, not a performance, not a display, just the quiet, continuous, specific ability to make someone feel that the room they were in was not as foreign as it had seemed a moment ago. She was working her way across the ballroom, one conversation at a time, when the change happened. She heard it before she saw it, a shift in the sound of the room, that specific drop in ambient noise that happens when something goes wrong in a public space and people begin to be aware of it without knowing why. She turned. Near the entrance to the east wing, a small group had formed. At the center of it was a man she recognized immediately, Hiroshi Tanaka. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and he was moving toward the exit, with the calm, deliberate pace of a man who has already made his decision and is simply executing it. Beside him, slightly behind, was a young man who could only be the assigned interpreter, young, clearly trained, and currently radiating the particular kind of panic that comes from knowing you have made an error that cannot be taken back. She did not need to know what the error was. The result was clear. The room had not stopped. The music was still playing. Most of the guests had not noticed, but the people who knew who Hiroshi Tanaka was, and in this room there were many of them, were watching with the stillness of people watching an expensive piece of crystal tipping toward the edge of a table. Clive Burton was already moving in from the left. Too direct, she thought immediately. Too urgent. A man that age, of that standing, being chased across a ballroom by an anxious executive. That would make it worse, not better. The approach itself would be the insult. She moved first. Not fast. Not cutting across the room in a way that drew attention. She moved in a natural line, the line of someone who simply happened to be walking in that direction, and she arrived at Hiroshi Tanaka's left side at the moment he was 3 steps from the corridor to the exit. "Tanaka-san," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. She spoke in Japanese. Not the stiff, careful Japanese of a learner, not the over-formal Japanese of a business textbook. She spoke in the warm, precise Japanese of someone who had sat with the language long enough to understand that the highest form of respect it could carry was ease. She addressed him correctly. She acknowledged the situation without naming the error. She said something small and slightly self-deprecating about the chaos of large events, something that was, in its own way, an invitation to find the whole thing a little amusing, rather than a matter of honor. There was a silence of about 4 seconds. Hiroshi Tanaka looked at her with the particular attentiveness of a man encountering something he had not expected. Then he said, in Japanese, "You are not from the Zhao Group." "No," she said. "I am an independent guest." He was quiet for another moment. Then, very slightly, the tension around his eyes released. "The room is very loud," he said. This was not a complaint. It was a small offering, a way back into the evening that did not require anyone to acknowledge what had almost happened. "It is," she agreed. "The table by the south window is quieter. I believe your seat is near there." He considered this. Then he turned away from the exit. He walked, not toward the corridor, but back into the ballroom, toward the south window. She walked beside him for 4 steps, long enough to confirm the direction, and then stepped aside. She did not look at Clive Burton. She did not look toward the center of the room where she knew Elliot was standing. She did not look at anyone. She picked up a fresh glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood quietly near the south wall and breathed. The room had unknotted itself around her. The music continued. The conversations resumed. Nothing had been announced. Nothing had been made into a scene. But things had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure, in the quality of the light. People who had been watching were now looking at her in a different way, with a different kind of attention. Not the look that says, "Who is that woman?" The look that says, "What is that person?" She finished her sparkling water. She set the glass down. She was calm. She was completely, thoroughly, factually calm, in the way that people are calm who have been preparing for something without knowing it for 10 years. She did not know exactly what came next, but she knew, standing in that ballroom with the chandeliers overhead, and the city outside and 10 languages sitting in her chest, as naturally as breathing, that whatever it was, she was ready for it. The dinner seating arrangement had been designed to separate conversations that might, if left to develop organically, become too interesting. This was standard practice at events like this one. Important guests placed at safe distances from each other, interpreters positioned at calculated intervals, potential alliances arranged or prevented according to whatever the host organization most needed from the evening. Mei Lin had not been assigned a seat. Her registration had been approved as an independent guest, which meant she existed in the organizational structure of the evening as a pleasant ambiguity. Present, accounted for, but not integrated. One of the junior members of the events team found her before the dinner was called and apologized with genuine distress, explaining that a seat could be arranged at one of the supplementary tables near the back. "That's perfectly fine," Mei Lin said. "Please don't worry about it." The young woman, her name tag said Lucy, looked slightly confused, as if she had expected something more difficult. "Are you sure?" "Completely sure," Mei Lin said. "I'm not here for the dinner." This was true, though she had not entirely understood it until the moment she said it. Lucy found her a seat near the east wall, a small table set with one place, slightly removed from the main dining floor, but with a clear sightline to the entire room. Mei Lin sat down and looked out at the assembled guests beginning to take their seats. The Zhao Group's senior leadership arranged across the main tables. Hiroshi Tanaka installed in the quieter seat near the south window as she had suggested, and she thought, this is exactly right. She had not come to sit at the head table. She had not come to be introduced, or to be acknowledged, or to have anyone say her name into a microphone. She had come because she had spent 10 years in rooms that didn't count her, and this room was going to count her whether it knew it yet or not. Elliot was at the primary host table. She could see him from where she sat. He had looked in her direction 3 times during the cocktail hour after the Hiroshi Tanaka moment. She had not met his gaze. She had simply continued doing what she was doing, which was being present and useful, in a room that had thought she was neither. The dinner began. She sat at her small table and ate quietly and watched, and what she was watching for was not drama. She was watching for the specific, practical fractures that appeared in the fabric of a multilingual event when the careful planning came into contact with actual human beings. These fractures were inevitable. She had learned this from years of reading, and from the far simpler truth that people were messier than plans. The first fracture appeared before the first course was cleared. A Saudi delegate named Faisal, she had identified him earlier from the circulated guest list, had been seated next to a woman named Caroline from the Zhao Group's European Partnerships Division. Caroline was intelligent and professionally confident, but the conversation had run into a wall that had nothing to do with intelligence or confidence. There were registers of politeness in Arabic professional conversation that simply did not translate into Western business small talk, and both of them were too polite to acknowledge the discomfort, so they were sitting in it instead. She did not approach the table. It was not the right moment for a third party to enter. Instead, she caught Caroline's eye as a waiter passed, and when Caroline's gaze landed on her, she gave a very small nod in Faisal's direction and made a gesture, subtle, barely a movement, that said, "Ask him about his field, his specific field, not his company, not his delegation, his area of professional expertise." Caroline was sharp enough to understand. She turned back to Faisal and asked, in clear and genuine curiosity, what specifically had drawn him to infrastructure investment. The question landed correctly. She could see it from across the room. The way Faisal's posture shifted slightly forward. The way his hands came off his lap. The conversation found its footing. She turned back to her own meal. Clive Burton appeared at her table before the second course. She had been expecting this, or something like it. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking. He was the kind of man who did not ask, and sat down and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been wrong about something and is deciding how to position himself in relation to that fact. "Clive Burton," he said, "I don't believe we've met properly." "We've met twice," she said pleasantly. "You won't remember." He did not try to argue this, which surprised her slightly. He was quiet for a moment. "The Tanaka situation," he said. "Was that planned?" "No," she said. "You speak Japanese." "Among other languages, yes." He looked at her steadily. Clive Burton was in his late 50s, still formidable in the way that men who have been powerful for a long time remain formidable, even when the room has shifted around them. But she could see something in his face that she had not expected, not hostility, not the dismissal she had received from him 12 years ago over the phone. Something closer to recalibration, the expression of a man updating a file. "How many?" he asked. 10, she said. He was quiet again. "Elliot never mentioned that." "No," she said. "He wouldn't." Clive looked across the room to where Elliot was sitting. Then he looked back at her. "You should have been here years ago," he said, and it came out simply, without fanfare, in the flat, factual tone of a business assessment. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement, which was, she suspected, the closest thing to an apology that Clive Burton was structured to produce. She said, "Yes." He stood up. He straightened his jacket. "I'll introduce you to Tanaka-san formally, if you like, before the evening ends." "I would like that," she said. He nodded, and went back across the room, and she watched him go, and thought about what had just happened, and decided that it was not a victory, not quite, but it was something real, something that sat in the actual world and weighed something. The evening moved forward. She moved through the remaining hours of it the way she had moved through the ballroom during the cocktail hour. Quietly, specifically, usefully. There was a moment with a Russian delegate named Ivan, who had been given incorrect information about the timing of a follow-up meeting. She corrected it in Russian, and he looked at her with the slightly stunned gratitude of a man who has been convinced he is lost, and then finds he is not. There was a moment with a German engineer named Klaus who had a question about a technical document that the Zhao Group's team had been routing to 3 different people without resolution. She read the relevant clause, identified the question he was actually asking, and directed him to the correct contact. She was not trying to impress anyone. This was the thing she had understood about herself years ago, sitting in her study with her books. The languages had never been about impressing anyone. They had been about being genuinely, specifically, concretely useful. The capacity to help without a filter of misunderstanding between you and the person who needed help. That was what all those years had built, and she felt it that evening not as power, but as something quieter and more solid. Competence. Real competence. Of the kind that exists whether or not anyone is watching. But people were watching. She became aware of it gradually. The way you become aware of a change in the weather. The junior events staff began to route questions in her direction. The delegates she had helped earlier in the evening returned with second questions, smaller ones, but they returned to her rather than to the official team. The senior partnership manager from the Zhao Group, a woman named Helena, precise and capable, who had clearly run events like this one many times, stopped beside her table at one point and simply stood there for a moment before saying, quietly, "You've been holding this evening together." "The evening is holding itself together," Mei Lin said. "I've just been filling in some gaps." Helena looked at her in the steady way of a woman who dealt in accurate assessments. "What's your background?" "Linguistics," Mei Lin said. "And 10 years of practice." "Are you available?" Helena said. "Professionally. We have a series of international meetings next quarter. We've been looking for a cultural consultant." Mei Lin looked at her. "I'm becoming available," she said. Helena handed her a card. Mei Lin took it. Elliot found her at 10:30, in the corridor between the main hall and the east wing. She had stepped out for a few minutes of quiet, and she heard him before she saw him. The sound of his footsteps, which she had been hearing for 10 years and still recognized. Before she registered, she was recognizing them. He called her name. She turned. He was alone. The confident ease he had carried earlier in the evening was not entirely gone, but it had shifted. He looked like a man who had been watching something unfold all evening, and had been waiting for the right moment to address it, and had now concluded that no right moment was coming, and so he was addressing it anyway. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again. Mei Lin. She waited. She gave him the time. She had always been fair. But nothing came. Whatever he had planned to say, the explanation, the positioning, the version of tonight's events that placed him in a reasonable light, it had found no language in which to present itself. She watched him understand this in real time, and it was not satisfying to watch. It was simply accurate. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said again. Just those two words, without anger, without performance. Just the simple factual statement of a woman who has known something for a long time, and has simply, now, said so. She turned and walked back into the ballroom. Behind her, she heard him not follow. She heard the exact moment his footsteps stopped. She did not look back. The hotel room was not expensive, and it did not need to be. It had a clean white bed, and a window that faced the street, and a small desk, and a coffee machine on the counter. She had booked it 3 weeks ago, the same night she had booked the gala registration, the same night she had gone to bed, and slept better than she had in years. She had told no one about it. She had simply arranged it, quietly, the way she had arranged all the important things in her life over the past 10 years. She arrived at the hotel at 11:45. She took off the dark dress and hung it carefully on the hook behind the bathroom door, and put on the hotel robe, and made herself a cup of tea from the small kettle on the counter, and stood at the window with it, and looked at the city below. It was still going. The city. She had sometimes wondered, in the very low moments of the past decade, whether things outside her quiet house were still moving at the same speed as always, or whether the stillness she lived inside had some quality that slowed everything down, like being at the bottom of deep water. But the city was going. Lights, traffic, people moving between places on their own chosen lines. She finished her tea. She sat down at the small desk and opened her Portuguese novel to the page she had marked the week before, and read for 20 minutes, and the words sat in her mind cleanly, without effort, the way things do when you are at rest, in a way that is not just the absence of activity, but the presence of something whole. At midnight, her phone lit up on the bedside table. She looked at it from the desk. 11 missed calls from Elliot. A text from his assistant marked urgent that she did not open. A second text, from a number she did not recognize but whose country code she identified immediately as Japanese. She picked up the phone. She opened the Japanese text. It was from the assistant of Hiroshi Tanaka. It was formal, correct in every register, and it said, in very clean Japanese, that Mr. Tanaka had greatly appreciated the conversation that evening, and that he wished, with her permission, to have his team follow up with her directly, regarding a professional opportunity. The message included a name, Yuki Nakamura, the head of his cultural liaison division, and a number. She sat with the phone in her hands for a long moment. Then she set it face down on the desk, not to ignore it, but because she wanted to do one thing at a time, and right now the thing she was doing was sitting in this quiet room, in this robe, in a city that was still moving, in a life she was in the process of reclaiming. She picked up her novel. She read 3 more pages. In the morning she woke at 7. The light coming through the curtains was the particular flat gray of early city morning, before the day has committed to a color. She lay still for a few minutes, which was something she had not done in years, had not allowed herself to do, because the mornings in the house had always carried the low-level pressure of being in a space that tolerated her, without quite welcoming her. This room welcomed her. She had chosen it. She had paid for it herself. It was small, and it was hers. She got up. She made coffee. Real coffee. Not as good as the kind she ground at home, but fine. She stood at the window with it, and watched the street below come to life, the delivery trucks and the early walkers and the city settling into another day. Her phone was on the desk where she had left it face down. She turned it over. The 11 missed calls from Elliot were still there. The urgent text from his assistant was still unread, and there was a new message, sent at 6:45 in the morning, which told her something about the time zone Yuki Nakamura was operating from, following up on the previous evening's message. Warm in tone, professional in structure, and containing a detail that she read twice to make sure she had it right. Hiroshi Tanaka's group was beginning a 14-country infrastructure partnership that would run for at least 5 years. They were looking for a chief cultural and linguistic consultant, someone who could operate across all 14 countries, manage communication strategy, facilitate negotiations, and ensure that the costly, relationship-ending misunderstandings that plagued international partnerships, the wrong honorific, the mistranslated clause, the cultural assumption that quietly collapsed a meeting, did not happen. They had been looking for this person for 8 months. They had not found anyone adequate. The salary figure at the bottom of the message was more than Mei Lin had spent on herself in the previous 5 years combined. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She read the message a third time. Then she thought about Elliot's voice in the hallway. Handle it. She thought about the white envelope on the kitchen counter. She thought about 10 years of rooms and notebooks, and the particular private joy of sitting with a language until it trusted her enough to open all its doors. She thought about Arnaud from France and Gustavo from Brazil and Sung Jin from Korea and Faisal and Ivan and Klaus and Helena's card in her bag and the way the ballroom had reorganized itself around her last night without anyone deciding it should. She thought about Owen in the garden, going still with surprise and then laughing, a real laugh, the first time she greeted him in Welsh. She picked up the phone. She called Yuki Nakamura's number. It rang twice. "Nakamura-san," she said, in Japanese, in the warm and specific and fully inhabited Japanese that had taken her 3 years to build and that lived in her chest now, as naturally as her own heartbeat. "Thank you for reaching out. I received your message." Yuki Nakamura's voice on the other end of the line was professional, pleasant, and clearly startled by the quality of the Japanese coming back at her. "Ms. Lin, thank you for calling. Mr. Tanaka hoped you would. I'd like to hear more about the position," Mei Lin said. "I believe I am exactly the right person for it." There was a brief and complete silence. Then Yuki Nakamura said, with a warmth that came through clearly even in the formal register, "We believe so too." They spoke for 40 minutes. At the end of the call, Mei Lin had been asked to come to a formal meeting the following week, in Tokyo, at Tanaka Group's main offices. She said yes. She noted the date and the address. She said goodbye in the correct register and ended the call. She sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in her lap. The 11 missed calls from Elliot were still there. She did not delete them. She did not return them. She simply set the phone back on the desk, face up this time. She thought about what she needed to do. There was a list, long and practical, of things that needed to happen: legal conversations, formal separations of accounts, arrangements for the house, the small and the large logistics of dismantling a shared life. These were real things, and they would take time, and they would not be simple, and she was not pretending otherwise. But none of that was the first thing. The first thing was the coffee in her hand, which was cooling slightly, and the city through the window, and the morning still opening itself up outside. The first thing was this room, which she had chosen, in this robe, which fit, with this novel on the desk and this notebook beside it and the list of 14 countries she was going to learn to navigate in their own languages, and on their own terms. She had already done harder things. She had done them alone, in quiet rooms, without anyone watching. She had built something in the silence that no one had known was being built, and now it was built, and it was entirely hers, and she was going to carry it into whatever came next, with the same patience and the same steadiness, and the same complete lack of apology with which she had built it. She finished her coffee. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top of the page she wrote, in clean, unhurried handwriting, the name of the first city she would visit for the new role. Then she began to prepare. She had always been good at preparing, and she had never, in 10 years of this life, been given so much to prepare for. Outside the window, the city was fully awake now, loud and layered and full of languages she knew. She could hear them almost, the way you hear music from another room. Not the specific words, just the shape of them. The particular music each language makes when it is being spoken by someone who belongs to it. She belonged to all of them, 10 of them, and counting. She turned to a fresh page in the notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote, Tokyo, next week. Then she started writing, and she did not stop for a long time, and the morning filled the room all around her, and she was exactly where she had decided to be.